The aim of MOUA is to tell stories about our marine world, and I hope that each one of these sculptures tells its own story. The artworks are a series of hybrid forms that are half human, half natural marine life that are approximately 2.2 meters tall. And the sculptures predominantly feature marine biologists whose work has led to a great understanding of the Great Barrier Reef and underwater marine ecologies. And I've used a variety of influences in the design, from natural mangroves and fig trees to several types of coral and mollusks. And by integrating these forms, I hope that we will show how humans and nature are both interdependent and ultimately one of the same. I decided to call the sculptures Sentinels. These sentinels are always metaphorically watching, protecting and sharing stories of the sea. I've been working on these sculptures for the past 2 years. It's been very different. Working during a pandemic meant that I had to adjust my normal process. Firstly, I start with photographs of each of the models to assess their body shapes and to sculpt their portraits. And I then use digital technology to scan natural elements that could then morph into a series of forms. These initial base forms and shapes were then 3D milled and hand sculpted to create a positive. And this was then silicon molded, a special stainless steel armature created inside, and then a rig designed to fill the molds upside down. It has required quite a bit of engineering, as these sculptures are almost 4 tons, were transported from the UK and then be attached to some large-scale foundations in Australia. Ultimately, they will all be anchored to the sea floor. Each of these works is made from a new green polymer concrete that has been developed in Australia and actually uses 75 to 87% less embodied carbon than standard Portland cement. These artworks are all designed to last for hundreds of years underwater, and it's hoped that they'll be quickly colonised and changed by the marine environment. It's been a real privilege working with some of the best marine biologists in the world, and it's actually afforded me a fascinating insight into their studies and practices, and I've seen a side of the reef that I've actually never seen before.
I've been working on corals for most of my life. Art and science go together very much, and they always have. It's about knowledge, and it's about beauty, and it's about people. And there's a little bit of art, a little bit of science in all those things. One can look at a very elegant piece of science and say, that is beautiful, just as one can look at a piece of art and say, wow, that is beautiful. Wow, it's incredibly good likeness. The genus is Goniastria, and the genus of the coral beneath that is Pectinia. What that statue is about is someone who really cares about the marine environment, who cares about life, and who's got an inquiring mind. And what we need to do is to turn kids into little scientists, so they'll carry on in whatever field they want to in adult life, but they'll always keep with them a love of a coral reef.
Magnetic Island, just off Townsville in the central Great Barrier Reef region, is where we discovered the mass coral spawning 40 years ago. Millions of different polyps from many hundreds of thousands of different colonies all start to reproduce on just a few nights each year. These are called mass spawning events because they involve so many different corals from so many different types and groups of corals on the reef. It's also ecologically critically important for the health of the Great Barrier Reef. Hundreds of millions of larvae develop, and those larvae drift around between reefs. Through that larval production, we get so many new corals settling onto reefs that kickstarts the recovery and the ongoing maintenance of the reef communities. What we do is capture part of this immense coral spawn slick that occurs at the sea surface after these mass spawning events, and we grow many millions of larvae in floating larval pools directly on the reef. We wait for about 5 to 7 days, and then we release those larvae back onto damaged sections of the reef to kickstart the recovery of the coral communities on those damaged reef areas. This process is known as coral IVF, or coral larval restoration. For my sculpture, I would really love it if we got some of the branching acropora corals and gradually overgrow me. That would be fantastic, because it would be yet another opportunity for corals to start growing and repopulating damaged reef areas.
I'm really privileged to be a part of the group of people picked to be sculptures to put underwater. Part of it, or a quarter, was carved out to be able to plant corals on. It's sort of been my mantra that there is hope, because if people think they can't do anything, they don't. We do now have the technologies and the capabilities to rescue our reefs. We do what's called a multiple cutting. We don't just plant one coral out there, let it grow up for dozens of years. We now take that coral at about year 5 or year 10, and we take and prune multiple more cuttings from it. From every one that we plant. It's not just a final planting, but it is a nursery for future plantings and cuttings. It took about a dozen or more years to literally work out the technology to grow corals at speed and at scale. And part of that was from some mistakes of breaking a coral, from one of the first test tube baby corals, to finding out we could grow hundreds and then thousands of corals, and that they fuse back together and form a living new tissue. So we can bring back 100-year-old corals back to life in just a couple of years, and they are sexually reproductive. That would have taken a part of a century. I'd like to see, with Plant a Million Corals, us transferring this technology. We are putting together all the things that are needed for a coral production nursery in a box, basically a shipping container, and it can be set up and literally plugged in and turned into a coral producing machine in any country or island around the world.
I'm a senior principal research scientist at Ames, and I'm leading a group of people here at present focusing on trying to understand the bottlenecks of reef recovery. So I came to Townsville in 1988 in order to work on coral reefs, because Townsville is globally the place to do coral reef research. I've seen many reefs around the world, but my main stomping ground really is the Great Barrier Reef, and living on Magnetic Island, which is surrounded by coral reefs, is just a real privilege. We are starting this big new project on the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. I love the concept of using art to communicate conservation issues to the broader public, because we scientists tend to focus on numbers and processes in scientific publications and so on. But to be able to reach an additional audience and attract them to come and have a look, and while experiencing the artwork, also seeing the beautiful fish and the corals and so on, is really appealing to me. And Townsville is world famous for its coral reef science.
I think it's a wonderful project, and I think it's a great tribute to the clams, and to have a statue coming out of a clam like that is wonderful. They're an emblem of the Great Barrier Reef, and you just will not see them like you see them here anywhere else. And I hope that brings people to think about the clams too in the ocean and what's happened to them in a lot of places. The Great Barrier Reef is the last large-scale area where you can find these clams. They've been overfished in other places to their death. So, it's very important that we also have learned to culture them. In 2012, we set up these 2 snorkel trails. And then in 2013, we got permits to move giant clams into the trails. And that's a special thing, to have them there. And they were put in small clumps, because that is where they belong if they're going to have successful fertilization. They have to be close together. It was a great thing to have them in there, and also to be able to follow how they do. I would say any autotrophic animal, corals too, is very important to the reef.
I hope that these sculptures will shine a spotlight on some of the incredible research, conservation efforts, activism, and traditional methods that are used to protect and understand the Great Barrier Reef. And I also hope that these artworks inspire people to learn more about the science that underpins the conservation of our natural wonders. And of course, ultimately, I hope that these works become a living and evolving part of the marine ecosystem, emphasizing both its fragility and inherent beauty.